Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. It is a great pleasure to introduce you to the second of our events accompanying the Citi exhibition, Arctic Culture and Climate at the British Museum. I'm Hartwig Fischer, Director of the British Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome Mary Robinson and Lord Stern for a conversation on climate after COVID, presented in collaboration with the British Academy. Our exhibition was realized in close collaboration with Arctic peoples. It celebrates their ingenuity and resilience throughout history. It tells the powerful story of respectful relationships with icy worlds and how its inhabitants have harnessed the weather and climate to thrive. The dramatic loss of ice and erratic weather caused by the climate change are putting unprecedented pressure on the Arctic peoples, testing their adaptive capacities and threatening their way of life. What happens in the Arctic will affect us all, and this exhibition is a timely reminder of what the world can learn from its peoples. Whilst we must temporarily close the museum because of the pandemic, and therefore the exhibition, it is most heartening that we can still reach our supporters, such as yourselves, through events like tonight's. If you have not yet had the opportunity to visit the exhibition in person, I do hope you will do when you are safely able to reopen, when we are safely able to reopen our doors. Even as we find ourselves in a second national lockdown, many in this country and around the world are asking what the long-term future looks like, both in terms of living with COVID-19 and how it may impact our policymaking and vision for the future. I'm delighted to welcome two fellows of the British Academy for this timely discussion on the planet's environmental future post-COVID-19. Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, is adjunct professor for climate justice at Trinity College Dublin and chair of the Elders. She is the recipient of countless awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from former President of the United States, Barack Obama. Her most recent publications include her memoir, Everybody Matters, and her book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future. Lord Nicholas Stern is the A.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government and chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at London School of Economics. He was knighted for services to economics in 2004 and appointed Companion of Honor for services to economics, international relations, and tackling climate change in 2017. Lord Stern's most recent publications include Economic Development in Palampur over 5 decades, and Why Are We Waiting? The Logic, Urgency, and Promise of Tackling Climate Change. Their conversation will be followed by a questions and answers session for which you can send us your questions by using your questions and answers function in Zoom. It gives me great pleasure indeed to introduce the speakers of this evening, and I do hope you enjoy the discussion. Mary and Nick, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hartwig. Mary suggested I kick off because, in a sense, I'm even more of the home team than Mary, although Mary is a fellow of the British Academy, is part of the home team. But I was deputy chair of the trustees of the British Museum, a trustee for 8 years, 8 wonderful years. And I'm a great admirer of the museum. And thank you, Hartwig, for your leadership and to all your wonderful staff for keeping it and growing it as the extraordinary place of learning and culture that it is. I haven't told Mary about this, but I'm just going to show one thing now. I've known Mary for a number of decades. I'm not quite sure how many, but about 2 decades ago, when I was chief economist of the World Bank, and Mary was in her job for human rights at the UN, Mary came to the World Bank and she gave me this. Yeah? And I've treasured it, Mary. I've kept it, and it's got an inscription from you inside it, and it says, "To Nick, with warmest regards, use it with conviction." So I've taken use it with conviction as my duty, and that's part of what we're doing tonight. I think Mary is talking about rights and justice in relation to these huge topics of COVID and climate. As Hartwig said, the story of the Arctic is a fast-forward story of what happens in climate change. It's lost 75% of its ice in the last half century, North Pole probably ice-free in 20 years. The way of life transforming, and it is a story of justice. I'm sure Mary, who's recently been to the Arctic, will develop that idea. I've not been to the Arctic. I have been to the Antarctic, but that's another story which we may or may not have time for. But we face as a world 2 crises together, the COVID crisis and the climate crisis. They're both deep, deep crises. The climate crisis even more severe and profound and long-lasting than COVID, but COVID has wreaked terrible damage and it's forced us to think. And some of the challenges that we face in COVID do help us understand climate. We'll be discussing some of that during the course of the conversation. We'll start with what's happening in some countries. And as the recipient of the Presidential Medal, Mary will indeed say something about the United States. I'll probably say a little bit about China and India and other key players. Europe, of course, vital in this story. Then we'll turn to the interactions between COVID and climate, how we have to drive out of these things, drive out of the COVID crisis in a way that puts us on the road to tackling the climate crisis. Mary will develop some of the very important ideas that she has offered to the world for a long period now, most recently in her book on climate justice. We'll turn to politics, culture, young people, and then I hope we'll look a bit forward and think about prospects and the role of ideas in tackling COVID and climate. So let's start then. Mary, you may tell us something about your recent trip to the Arctic and perhaps go on to United States.
Well, thank you, Nick. And first of all, thank you also to Hartwig and the British Museum for the opportunity to have this conversation on climate after COVID with you. As you say, we go back quite a long way. The exhibition, the short video that we saw, literally brought back to me a moment when I was on a scientific expedition to Greenland in August 2019. We were asked to be on our own and listen to a glacier, which was close to the small place where we were staying. And I sat and listened in bright sunshine, 16 degrees Celsius in August. And the noise of the calving was like thunder. And I could feel the stress. I could feel that it wasn't natural, that the glacier was actually under pressure of calving too quickly. And I found tears coming into my eyes because we shouldn't be doing this to Mother Nature. I felt that so profoundly, and it has stayed with me. And it was a particular insight that maybe Indigenous people have so often, and I've often talked about how close they feel to nature. Well, I had that moment, and it stays with me. And I want to talk briefly, first of all, because I'm chair of the elders, as was mentioned, about how the elders really see the need for multilateralism to work in order that we tackle COVID. We actually issued a paper, and since you've shown something, I'll show our elders paper called Hope for a Sea Change, Why Multilateralism Must Reshape the world after COVID-19. And we don't have great multilateralism currently in our world today, because apart from that paper, which is very much on the side of hope and the side of a positive approach to multilateralism, we have to deal with the fact that even in a democracy like the United States, we are very deeply concerned and have issued a strong statement today about the importance of basically expressing our deep concern at the failure of the Trump administration to respect the United States democratic transition to power. I have a master's in law from Harvard Law School. I studied the Constitution of the United States. I thought it had the best and strongest balances to support its constitution in the world. And yet we're seeing the politicization of the Supreme Court. We're seeing it shows us how we have to defend our democracies and defend multilateralism. But we're also talking in this discussion about COVID. And Nick, I think we are only beginning to realize how serious COVID is for the economies of the world. So maybe back to you to say a little about how serious it is, and then maybe also how countries like China and Japan are beginning to cope in the context also of climate.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, and thank you for the elders' letter. What happens in the most rich country in the world, and one that constantly declares for democracy, is of vital importance to democracy elsewhere.
We were very sad to have to do it. We've commented on electoral processes and democratic failings in lots of countries, in a number of countries, but it's sad when it has to be the United States, but we felt it was necessary to do it.
Yeah, and it's an example of the profound importance of ideas and actions in one country for the rest of the world. On the COVID crisis, it is something like the Spanish flu after the First World War, the Deep Depression of the 1930s, and the need for reconstruction after the Second World War, all rolled into one. It is quite extraordinary. It's truly global. In the sense that COVID is everywhere, and the recession from COVID, whether or not there's a lockdown, the recession from COVID is everywhere. The global financial crisis, big and important though that was, 2008-10, that was a crisis in the rich countries, actually created by their own negligence and ineptitude, which had knock-on effects around the world. This crisis, the COVID crisis, is everywhere. And the fall in output and the rise in unemployment has been quite extraordinary. In the UK, the biggest fall since the collapse of the South Sea bubble 300 years ago in terms of pace of change. The children out of school, deeply damaged. We know that the early education is of profound importance, and that damage will not be fully caught up. Young people who shut out of the labour market. We know that if you're shut out of the labour market when you first look for a job, that scars your career and your productivity for the rest of your life. This is a devastating story, COVID. We will climb out of it. It'll take us a few years from the point of view of the economy, but the scars will be there. The rich countries, and just, I'm an economist, so let me do that for just a moment. The rich countries can borrow in their own currencies. They can issue money. So they can do what it takes. They can just expand demand, expand the government expenditure very quickly. And they've done that. So they're trying to do what it takes, but the poorer countries are only doing what they can. And that's very limited because they cannot borrow in their own countries. In Africa, they've been unable to access the capital markets. All of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, unable to access the capital markets since February. So they're enormously limited in what they can do. So the magnitude of the COVID crisis across the world, I don't think has been fully appreciated or understood in the rich countries. And we have a duty to collaborate here. And we know that
I've heard you talk, Nick, about the special drawing rights that could be available from the International Monetary Fund. Can you say a little about that in a way that we can understand?
I'll try. Yeah, the International Monetary Fund can essentially create spending power. In roughly speaking, they can create money in the sense that they can issue special drawing rights to the shareholders of the IMF. Now, those are distributed according to the shareholding in the IMF, the so-called quotas, roughly speaking. So that would mean the richer countries could get more, or would get more from the issue of special drawing rights. But they could lend that on, and it should be at essentially zero interest rates, to poorer countries right away. And that can be converted into foreign exchange. So that overcomes the problem that I tried to describe. It allows them to spend more, and it allows them to borrow in foreign currencies. It allows them to take the action corresponding to the action in the rich countries to try to keep their economies going, to try to keep the kids at school, to try to get the health systems to function in face of this terrible stress. So it's a rather technical thing, special drawing rights from the IMF, but it could lead to direct help for the countries of the developing world to take the decisions in their own way that they feel they need to take, say, to keep the kids at school, to keep the health system functioning, and to make the investment that's necessary for transforming to the low carbon economy.
And presumably that would be combined with debt relief.
Yes, it could be and should be combined with debt relief, but it would ease the pressure on formal debt relief. It would enable them to get through this very difficult period. It has been blocked by the United States. We live in hope that a Biden administration would unblock, but that would be an example of a global problem like COVID and a response that comes from international action and international
And what about China coming out earlier than most countries?
Well, China is crucial in this story because China is already growing back again quite strongly. The world desperately needs demand. China is very important from the point of view of debt because China holds, something like a quarter of sub-Saharan African debt now, and money that's been lent to support various kinds of investments. But China is very important for world demand, very important for world debt, and fundamental importance from climate change. 28% of the world's emissions, round double the United States. This is enormously important in terms of world emissions. And that's why it's so important in September that President Xi Jinping, in his speech to the United Nations, said that China would go carbon neutral by 2060. Now, Europe's declared carbon neutral by 2050. A couple of weeks ago, Japan declared declared net zero by 2050, and South Korea followed the next day. Europe, of course, did that at the end of last year. So what you've got now with the Biden White House declaring for net zero by 2050, you've got way over half the world's economy dedicated to net zero by 2050. Now, 2050 is 2050. This next decade is of vital importance. It's the decade of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the decade where we have to cut world emissions by about half in just one decade to give ourselves anything like a reasonable chance of holding to 1.5 degrees. So we have to think of 2050, but we have to think of this next decade as being absolutely decisive. And that's why the drive out of COVID is has to be a sustainable recovery and set us on the right road. But Mary, you've taught us so much about climate justice and why there's this deep moral imperative to go down that route. And I think it'd be really splendid if you could share some of those ideas.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we link climate to people, that we make it very people-centered in their lives. And that's why I think we start with the injustices of climate change. And the first injustice is that it disproportionately and much earlier affects the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples. they also happen to be the black and brown and indigenous peoples of our world. So there's a racist element there. Secondly, a gender injustice within that, because women have different social roles. They often have less power, less land rights. They have to put food on the table. They have to go further in the drought for water and so on. The third injustice is the intergenerational injustice that children with their Fridays for Future have been calling us out on, our generation, telling us, listen to the science and give us a future. The fourth injustice is a subtle one, but one that you'll perfectly understand, Nick. It's the different pathways to development of industrialized countries and developing countries. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel. Now we have to wean ourselves off with just transition. But developing countries, before Paris, and I was there as the special envoy of the Secretary General, I remember it very well, and you were there. They promised in their nationally determined contributions that they would go as green as possible. But they made it clear, we will need the investment, we will need the technology, we will need the skills. And they actually have not got that solidarity. And they are finding more coal and a lot of oil and a lot of gas. Countries in Africa, for example, and elsewhere. What are they to do? They have to bring their people out of poverty. If they go the dirty route, they will suffer first and worst, but we will all suffer because we'll use up the carbon budget. So it's sensible for us to understand the need to share that technology and to ensure that developing countries can go as green as possible. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature. The loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species, what made me cry in Greenland. What has COVID taught us? I think we've got at least 4, maybe even 5 lessons that I go through very briefly. The first is that collective human behavior can matter. That's what's protecting us from the virus before we get a vaccine, by complying with social distancing, etc. Secondly, government matters. We see bad government and loss of life, including in the big democracy that we're worried about. Disproportionately high deaths and illness because of bad governance. We see good governance, women-led governments doing particularly well. I could go out into detail on that, but I won't. The third thing is that science matters. Governments are listening to their health experts and dealing with COVID better if they do that. And we must listen to the climate scientists as never before as we come out. And a fourth thing, and it's subtle, is compassion matters. We're seeing neighborliness. We're seeing an empathy that wasn't there before because we're all out of our comfort zone because of COVID. It's not a great leveler, it's actually exacerbating the inequalities. We're all kind of back in our homes with our families, realizing what really matters and the jobs that really matter. Healthcare jobs and low-paid jobs, often women's jobs. And finally, and this is something in your ball court, when money is needed, it somehow becomes available. And my sense, and I'd like you to maybe respond to this, my sense is governments are borrowing a lot at the moment because of the need to steady things during the awful impacts of COVID. But I feel we're going to have to hold our nerve and borrow more as we come out to deal with climate in a transition way, to make that transition, and to borrow more because we're borrowing our children's money so that they would have a future.
I absolutely agree, Mary, and thank you for your leadership on justice in this context, and of course much more broadly. The lessons I think from COVID are surely the ones you described, but also very importantly, we've learned that we can change quickly if we have to. We've learned to ask ourselves, having gone through this, what do we want? And I think there's a real sentiment to build back better or see the COVID recovery as a link to the better world that we want to create. Just as after the Second World War, across Europe, we worked hard to create new institutions. In the UK, of course, you got the social safety nets, the National Health Service, and so on. And as a world as a whole, we created the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the Declaration of Human Rights, indeed. And so that moment of trauma, not more than a moment, that period of trauma during the Second World War made us reflect. And we reflected about the kind of society we as a world, and we in Europe in particular, wanted to become. And we made the changes, and we did transform the world, and we transformed Europe. And of course, the United States was enormously helpful through the Marshall Plan. And we need something like the Marshall Plan to drive us out of COVID and onto a story of much more attractive forms of growth and development. And that is something which I think is increasingly understood. And in climate now, we're seeing that we do have to invest. We do have to invest a lot. But actually, those investments have enormously valuable returns, including cities where you can move and breathe and be productive, ecosystems, biodiversity, which is robust and fruitful. So it's not actually a sacrifice now, in any sense, to look after the environment. You're not sacrificing standard of living to look after the environment, but you do have to invest and you do have to innovate. And that's why resources from the rich countries are so important in that process of this transformative investment we need to make. And we can come out of COVID in a similar way.
Yeah. Can I just, bring this home to Glasgow, to the COP next year, where the United Kingdom has promised us a transparent and inclusive COP. And yet it's all men who are determining this wonderful inclusive COP. I mean, that's one thing. But secondly, we do need countries and corporations and cities, etc., to step up. And somehow we need to measure this more. We need more ways of showing that we don't want greenwash. We don't want PR speak. We want to see, I know there's the task force on climate-related risks, and I was in Japan for their last meeting. That's good, but we need more. And how do you see us getting this COP to bring us that very important step further? And when is it going to become more inclusive?
Well, we have real difficulties in gender representation in leadership around the world, including in my own profession, economics, I hasten to add. But I would point to Patricia Espinosa as the executive secretary, a wonderful executive secretary of the
Yes.
CCC, and Amina Mohammed, who's the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, who's been a great leader on, as you know very well, on climate issues. But your challenge is well taken. December the 12th will be a major event. That will be 5 years on from Paris. And I hope and I believe that the strategy for the road to Glasgow from December the 12th will be laid out at that point. I'm working very closely.
The trouble is that's before Biden can really commit, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And but Biden is already declared that he's going to go rejoin Paris, that he's going to commit the United States to be net zero emissions by 2050. He's got a very good plan for rebuilding in the United States. He's getting together good people. So I'm quite optimistic that he'll hit the ground running, as they say, on that one. And he won't be there formally representing the United States, but I'm pretty sure that there'll be some people speaking in December the 12th and around, drawing on, as it were, the Biden administration. And of course, by Glasgow itself, he will be the president. He will have been the president for several months. But I wanted to, perhaps we should spend a little bit of time, Mary, talking about politics and culture and young people, because I'm very fortunate to be in a university, and even though you get older, they stay the same age. So you see the cohorts of young people passing in front of you and being with you. And this last 3, 4, 5 years, it's been inspirational. I mean, the young people have challenged. They've challenged in a very well-informed way, as you described. And they are picking the big subject, and they're on the right side of history. I think it's fair to say Mary, that we were undergraduates during the 1960s. And the big issues for us were apartheid, the Vietnam War, and civil rights. And we were strong and we were pushy, but we were on the right side of history. Now, it took quite a long time for some of those things to fall into place. But I do feel as if the young people have been fundamental in changing the politics. And I wonder if that's been, your experience in Ireland and beyond.
Yes, I think so, Nick. And actually, the interesting thing is that they're much younger now. I mean, look at those youngsters who are leading the Fridays for Future. It started with Greta Thunberg when she was only 15. I remember the photograph of her in front of the Parliament with her handmade sign. I saw a photograph of it. And I thought, that's not going to go anywhere. How wrong I was. I'm interacting with 13, 15, and 16-year-olds who are very knowledgeable about the science. They've read it up. They understand that unless we change, and they're becoming they're becoming more climate anxious, which is worrying, because they don't see the kind of commitment to change that they would like to see. It's beginning to turn, but they'd like to see it more actively. But I do very much agree with you. I think, I learned a lesson from Archbishop Tutu when he was the chair of the elders. We were together in New York at an event that involved young people on their social things. It was a social good conference, and they were all on their iPads and their iPhones, creating a social media buzz. We were supposed to be trending, I'm an elder, so I don't really understand all these things. But anyway, and Archbishop Tutu, when he's in front of a young audience, gets very excited. And he was, saying beautiful things like, how wonderful they were, etc. And the moderator got quite sharp with him and said, Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist? And he turned to her and he said, oh no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope. And I think that was a profound expression, because it means the glass may not be, and I think I can see a glass, and I've been drinking during the, so it's not quite half full, but there's something there. And that's the difference in the climate space. If we talk about, and some scientists do this very effectively and very compellingly, how bad it is, and that we're meeting these tipping points very early, and all the energy goes out of the room, and actually people can't take that. It goes over their head and they say, well, I'll just get on with my life. Whereas if you say everybody can do something, for example, I often say there are 3 steps that everybody should take. First of all, make it personal in your life. And you only know you've made it personal if you change something. Change the way you're recycling, change your diet, do something. You own it then. And secondly, get angry with those who aren't taking their responsibility properly and try and, join or vote or use some pressure. And thirdly, and this is something you touched on, imagine this world that we need to be hurrying towards. And that's beginning to happen. I am very impressed by, as you say, Biden's plans for infrastructure in the United States. But I was very impressed by Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union reference to the European Bauhaus idea. I had to look up the Bauhaus again and think about it. And I'm seeing, because I'm in touch with a lot of architects and artists, it has taken off. They really are excited about this Bauhaus idea. And I wonder whether you can speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think it's why it's so important in discussing climate issues to talk about what we need to do, what it looks like, and to underline that it's enormously attractive. Often we begin the discussions, and probably we do have to begin the discussions, with the terrible existential risks associated with unmanaged climate change, the grave injustices, loss of lives and livelihoods that you were describing, Mary. But there's another way. And that way, as we look at it and get closer to it and we begin to create it, looks enormously attractive. If you just take the cost of renewable power. Now, in India, the round-the-clock solar, that means solar plus storage, supplying to grids on substantial scale, outcompetes fossil fuels. And that's without a carbon price and without any subsidy. That's a technology whose cost is still falling. The cost of solar, the cost of storage is still falling. If you think, as you were describing, Mary, about architecture, the kinds of ways that people are designing buildings now, the kind of materials they're using, and actually some of it is looking back to traditional ways of building, which knew what their environment was like. They knew how to build in hot climates to keep cool. They knew how to build in cold climates to stay warm. Arctic being a clear example. So some of the story of architecture is discovery, creation, new materials, and digital management of buildings. Some of it is actually observing what was known and using what was known in old cultures. Look what's happening to transport. I mean, who would have thought a dozen or so years ago that all the major car companies would be talking in terms of the end of the internal combustion engine? I mean, electric vehicles are just better. You know, they last longer, they're more efficient. When we go to scale, we can build an electric car probably in half the person years that it takes to build the internal combustion engine. So,
but Nick, you know, that's on the positives. But I have to ask you, because I know you know the situation in China probably better than many people in this part of the world. China is going a lot into coal at the moment. You know, it's, what is it, a $500 billion to come out of COVID plan is going to local authorities, and they seem to be investing in coal. I mean, and they haven't really greened the Belt and Road infrastructure. Will they do that?
China's changing, and COVID has, in a sense, intensified some of the arguments that are going on inside China. There are many people inside China who are looking to a much cleaner future, one that's higher tech, based more on services, where the cities function much better, where degraded land is restored, the biodiversity is enhanced. Others are saying, we have a crisis here. We've got to get back on our feet. Let's just do what we know, and we know how to do coal. That battle is still being fought through. I'm optimistic about China, that coal has actually plateaued in China really over the last 5 years, but it's bounced up and down. And just now, you're right, Mary, it's bounced up. But they've shown that they can plateau in coal, and it's clear that they can drive it on downwards. But this is a moment when internationalism is so important, to reach out a hand, show what Europe is doing, ask to share technologies, because China's pretty good at a lot of that, act as partners. And in that way, I think reinforce those within China who want to push in a good direction. It's going to happen in China. The question is how fast. And the Belt and Road Initiative, Mary, is enormously important. Now, the population of the Belt and Road countries is around double that of China. Now, and they're about half the income per capita of China. If in 20 years, those countries look like China now, then say goodbye to 3 or 4 degrees, let alone 2 degrees. So China's relationships with the Belt and Road countries is enormously important, and they are still funding coal in those countries. So
when I was in China in April 2019 with the elders, and we met with President Xi and his top brass, we discussed the Belt and Road, and their point was, we have to comply with the rules of the countries that were providing energy and infrastructure in. But actually, why can't China provide rules for its own companies wherever they operate, so that they can't do coal?
They can and they should, Mary, and that's something which we as partners of China should try to help with. Indeed, setting our own standards. I mean, South Korea and Japan have been funding coal-fired power stations as well. And of course, Europe still pushes fossil fuels in many circumstances. So I think acting strongly in Europe, setting very clear examples. I think our export credit agencies shouldn't be funding fossil fuels.
Exactly. The elders have been pointing this out, including the UK.
Yeah. So pointing the finger at China is one thing. If you point the finger at ourselves as well. But I think
the elders don't want to point fingers at all. We want to kind of see exactly what you're talking about, real cooperation. And
let me delete the finger pointing metaphor. That's not the bad one. The bad one. We must reflect on ourselves, look at ourselves, ask questions of ourselves, and then, you know, in that context, we can ask questions of partners, and they can ask questions of us. And that's the kind of collaboration and multilateralism that we need in order to drive the investment forward. We need to get out of COVID and to get out of the climate crisis. And
it's clear from what President-elect Biden has been saying that he really wants to get back, as you said, the Paris Agreement, but all of the other things, the WHO, I think, but more than that, he knows so many of the leaders because he's been around so long, and he wants to have that kind of, so hopefully we may be coming out of this very dangerous, bumpy time for multilateralism, where because of bad example from the Trump administration and Trump himself, we were seeing an autocratic populist way of doing that was very damaging and continues to be very damaging. So I'm relatively hopeful that we may be moving in 2021 into a better international cooperation, but the rifts are still strong, even in trade. I mean, will trade come back together?
It's going to take a lot of investment to overcome the damage. You know, a lot of investment in each other and ideas to overcome the damage. I think, you know, it's wonderful that Joe Biden is coming back in, and that will prevent further damage. But some of the scarring, some of the destruction of trust will take a long time to put together. You know, some people have hidden behind, as it were, the White House. You know, Mexico, Brazil, to some extent Australia, have taken, as it were, the reluctance, the stepping back in the White House as an excuse to do some of that themselves. The trust in mutual agreement and commitment. I'm one of the members of the House of Lords who voted strongly against the the bill, which would essentially mean that we would break the agreement that we had with Europe around Brexit. And we had that vote just a few days ago in the Lords. Those things add up. You know, people go on breaking international agreements, stepping away, then you really do undermine trust. So there's a lot of rebuilding to do. And I've seen you very eloquent on that, Mary, if you want to develop that idea.
Yes, very much so. I think the more we can get back to the kind of spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals in September 2015, agreeing, because they were voluntary, but nonetheless agreeing a complex framework of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and then shortly afterwards, 195 countries agreeing the Paris Agreement. We can do it. We can actually work together internationally for the common good, but we need to, as you say, in a humbler way, you know, with more humility now, understand the fragility of countries that may have thought they were better than others or above others or whatever. No, we're all we're all in the struggle together. And maybe COVID has been, in that way, a kind of leveler.
Let's hand over now to Hartwig to ask us some questions from those who are participating. But let's do it on a note of optimism, because I think one thing that Mary and I clearly share, we're enormously optimistic about what we can do. We can now see the way to drive out of COVID in a sustainable way. You know, investing in our cities, you know, retrofitting our buildings, getting people to work on forests, restoring degraded land. They're all things we can do quickly, labor intensive.
Listening to the voices of grassroots women and indigenous women. And
absolutely, in working out how you do it.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Which is
there's optimism about what we can do, but we worry deeply about what we will do. But it's public discussion that takes us from what you can do to what you will do. Let's pass over to you.
Thank you so very much, Mary and Nick. That was a fabulous conversation full of thoughts and optimistic suggestions. And here's some questions that, in a good way, I think will challenge that optimism without veering into pessimism. So here's a question by David Cotton. How can we get rid of our obsession for economic growth? In the rich countries, we already have enough wealth. What we need to do is distribute it more equally. If we stop growing, then available resources will last longer. How can we get rid of our obsession for economic growth?
Well, David, I see where you're coming from, but I don't think I agree with you. Suppose we stopped growth right now. We're emitting rather more than 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent a year. We've got to get that down to net zero by mid-century. We're not going to go from 50 billion tons of emissions a year to net zero by mid-century by having zero consumption in mid-century. The challenge is to break the relationship between the destructiveness of the way we consume and produce and the environment. If we can change the way we can consume and produce to make it far less destructive, and indeed eventually by mid-century, go to net zero, then that's the transformation which will take us where we want to go. In so doing, we can have cities which are much less congested and polluted. Actually, that will be more productive. That will be increasing living standards. If we change the way we do our agriculture and make it less polluting of the rivers and the soil, less degrading of the soil, less deforestation, we know how to do that. Actually, our standard of living will rise. So I do see where that's coming from, but I can't go along with it because I think it's the wrong way to go. And I think it would actually be devastating from the point of view of politics. And Mary and I can't travel around the world, go to India or wherever we go and say, I'm sorry, it's all full up, this atmosphere, no more consumption, you can't grow anymore. When actually the answer is to find a way of growing, as Mary was describing earlier, which is much more attractive, much less destructive, and more equitable, more inclusive. And that's the route to go, in my view.
I would agree, Nick, but briefly, I want to just add, I think we need to address the rampant, unfair capitalist system that is driving a lot of this. And I'm glad to say that is happening. I'm talking to business leaders who are talking about reset. It's a big word now. And it's saying it's not just shareholder value, that we make a profit for our shareholders. It's stakeholder value. And the stakeholders include the workers and the communities that the company impacts on, and the sustainable development goals are relevant, and just transition is relevant. And I'm hearing all this language. We need a new social contract.
We do. It's about changing the incentives. I mean, things like carbon prices, stop to tax the nasty bad things, stopping subsidizing things like fossil fuels. But it is also changing behavior, making us much more conscious of waste and pollution. And, you know, now I think people are discussing what is a firm for, or Milton Friedman used to say that simply to make profits for the shareholders. Now I think
his time is over. His time is over.
Now he's gone. He's gone. And it's now, I think, you know, one of my friends, Colin Mayer, in work for the British Academy, actually described the purpose of the firm as to find profitable solutions to the problems of people and the planet. The first operative word in that sentence is profitable, because otherwise the firm doesn't survive. But that's not the purpose. I mean, the purpose of life is not breathing, but you need breath to live. But the purpose of the firm in that context is to find solutions. And those ideas, I think, are changing. So consumers are changing behavior, firms are changing behavior. You have to get the incentive structures right. But every time we wax optimistic, and from time to time we do, it's very important to observe we are nowhere near fast enough. We haven't even stopped emissions rising yet.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic again about what we can do. Will we is the point.
Could I follow up with another question? This one by John Riley. It is now accepted that positive feedback mechanisms in the climate systems cannot now be stopped. No matter what we do, they're locked in. Therefore, we must ask how we can grow food and survive when the temperatures head for 4 to 5 degrees.
Again, I think that's too pessimistic. Drawing our attention to tipping points is very important. And the Arctic is a very clear example of that, because as you lose the whites from the snow and the ice, then you are absorbing more of the ultraviolet that comes in. It doesn't bounce back in the same way as it would off a white surface. As the permafrost starts to thaw, you start to release methane. So the Arctic is a very powerful example of these positive feedback effects in operation. What that does for me is to say how fast we have to act. We have to cut emissions by 50% in the next decade. This next decade is absolutely decisive in terms of the future. But the second part of the question is adaptation and resilience. How can we adapt? We're going to have to adapt. We're going to see sea level rise. We're going to see storm surges. We're going to see desertification in some parts of the world. And it's those poorest countries of the world, as Mary was emphasizing very clearly, and the poorest people in the richer parts of the world who are the most vulnerable. So whilst I do not think it's too late to act, it's very clear that a lot of climate change is coming, and we're going to have to adapt to it. And there it seems to me that the lessons from the people of the Arctic about how to adjust to different kinds of environments are enormously important.
Maybe if there are other questions, I'll pass on this one.
Mary, here's the question for you. You're pointing out of humility. It's a question by Elizabeth Lemoyne. You're pointing out of humility is very key. How do we encourage greater humility through every level of society? And perhaps I could add another question. In what ways can indigenous knowledges and ideas assist the climate policy debate, and what reception and level of attention have they been given so far?
Thank you, Elizabeth, for both questions, if you're responsible also for the second one. Let me start with it, actually, because I spent a lot of time and with great interest in listening to Indigenous peoples, in supporting the Indigenous Peoples Forum in the COPs, in working with the Vulnerable Forum, which included a lot of countries and a lot of Indigenous peoples. And when I served as High Commissioner for Human Rights in the United Nations, I was the, what was I? I was something of the decade of Indigenous peoples, and discovered that there were about 400 million, at least at that time, worldwide. That was 1997 to 2002. It's much more now. The richness of the learning, the traditional Indigenous wisdom is huge. And you know where I'm dealing with it now with great pleasure? In my podcast called Mothers of Invention. We have interviewed a significant number, mainly women from the South, either in the United States or globally, and many of them are Indigenous, and the wisdom is striking. So I recommend, we've had 3 series now, and we just finished the 3rd series of Mothers of Invention. I also do it with a comedian, so there's a lot of humor. So it's a different way of addressing that. Indigenous people save the forests. They're the ones that are doing so much of the saving of the forests and saving of the seeds, etc., etc. So back to the humility. In many ways, I think we need to listen to those on the front lines of the climate issue and see how they are coping. How they are coping in Bangladesh. Just coping is one of the best countries for adaptation because they have to, and etc. And that was what my book on climate justice was about. 11 stories, 9 of them involved women, but there were 2 good men as well, Nick. There were 2 good men, but I think that a woman's way of leading, when it's done in the way I'm talking about, the kind of what I call a feminist way of leading, and a feminist approach, it's collaborative, it's problem solving, it's listening to the experts like the science. And we have seen women-led governments do better under COVID because of this way of listening. And then it's bringing your people with you because you have a strong sense that you serve. It's a leadership of service that is so important.
Could I just relate something very quickly to an exhibition at the British Museum 7 or 8 years ago on Indigenous people in Australia? And it was at the time when I was a trustee. And it was absolutely remarkable. And it really taught humility, because the societies that were being examined and displayed and we were trying to understand as outsiders were societies that had actually been successful for about 30,000 years. 30,000, I mean, that makes you humble. That is the most successful civilization in history, I should have thought. Hartwig, you're the historian, but that was a way of living, a way of understanding, a way of living with nature, a way of adapting, which went through all kinds of weather, climate changes. But it was successful for about 30,000 years before Europeans came along and disrupted it. That's the kind of lesson I think that a wonderful museum like the British Museum can carry.
And I think this was very much based on an understanding that we're not the masters, but the guests of the planet. Here's a question by Ben White. Given governments are borrowing huge amounts to sustain their populations through the pandemic, where will be the main sources of climate finance after the pandemic? What is the main barrier preventing this from reaching the best projects?
I'll try to be quick here, but I suppose that's for the economists. I mean, essentially, this is about investment. I don't think now anymore about climate investment. I just think about investment. All our investment should be sustainable. We shouldn't be doing any investment that's unsustainable. So how are we going to fund investment? Well, that, it seems to me, the governments have to commit to growing out of the COVID crisis. Economists go on about debt to GDP ratios. There's debt in the numerator and GDP in the denominator or output. Then what we have to do is to grow. We have to manage our debt by growing. And we've seen this tremendous collapse in output during the crisis. But as we do that, we have to grow in a different way. It's back to the point I was making earlier. We have to grow in a way that's not destructive in the way that our past patterns of growth have been. We have to raise living standards, particularly in the developing world, where that's the most important. We have to raise living standards in a way which is much less destructive. That will be through decisions that they themselves make, investments that they themselves choose to make. It's our duty in the richer world to help with the financial system that can support those investments and with the technologies, as Mary was emphasizing earlier.
Mary?
Well, it's not exactly the point, but I do want to point out that very little of climate financing for the last number of years and continuing gets to groups on the ground, communities on the ground, mainly women, who are addressing and building resilience in their communities, trying to adapt. We still haven't got enough money for adaptation. There's a very good commission on adaptation, which has made good recommendations. But if you look at where the money is going, it's actually not necessarily going enough to those on the ground who are helping their communities to become more resilient, which is so important at the moment.
And perhaps a question by Rhiannon Gittins follows up on that. How can we make sustainable choices? How can we make sustainable choices more affordable so that they are accessible to all individuals?
Mary, do you want to go first?
I think that's quite important, because when we talk about food, for example, first of all, we waste a third of the food in the world, which is shocking and awful. So we need to address dealing with that. But very often organic food is more expensive. So it's all very well, some people of a certain income can do that. But what about, and the diet of people at a lower income is so much worse from that point of view, both from a climate point of view, from every point of view. So we need to think much more, and this is part of the discussion that we have on Mothers of Invention, precisely as to how we ensure that going green is also affordable. It is extremely important. And if necessary, we have to subsidize the right things, not the wrong things. But we certainly have to ensure that it is affordable.
And I think tackling waste is extremely important, as Mary described, and there's so much that we can do to do that. If we can think of that in a much more general way in terms of the circular economy, which is husbanding our resources much better, thinking about that as a way, as an approach to design. If we husband our resources better through the circular economy, then essentially they get cheaper. But you have to do some investing to get there. So we have to invest to manage that transition. But many of the things that are sustainable are already cheaper, like renewable electricity, and they can become cheaper if we invest wisely and change the way we make and do things. But that's a challenge of policy in terms of taxing the bad things, subsidizing the good things. And it's a matter of design, and it's a matter of thinking about how we live.
Mary, Nick, thank you very much indeed for this inspiring conversation. Delighted that
it was fun.
Delighted you joined us tonight, and I'm particularly grateful that you highlighted the immense contribution that Indigenous peoples are making to this, to our thinking, to our debate, to developing sustainable solutions for the future. And of course, we hope that as soon as we're out of lockdown and the British Museum can reopen, that our listeners tonight will come and see the exhibition, because this exhibition is really about the incredible contribution that the peoples around the Arctic Circle are making to exactly that question, that debate, our shared challenging future. So thank you very much for coming in tonight. Great pleasure seeing you. And we hope to see you at the British Museum soon, as I hope everyone listening tonight will join us at the British Museum to see the exhibition. Thank you for joining us tonight. We expect you back on the 19th of November for our next event. And until then, keep safe and see you soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you.